going on? No horsing around, family. Zach Boyd back at it again. And as always, this podcast is sponsored by WagerWire. And guys, you got to get your bets in. Last week of college football, definitely hop on over there to WagerWire. You can place bets, you can shop them, you can trade them up to the wire, you can even cash them in early. That's www.wagerwire.com, www.wagerwire.com, and join the waiting list for the app coming next year. Here to join us, Kevin Bowen, 107.5 The Fan, Kevin and Query in the morning. You guys all know him, Kevin's Corner Podcast. How you been, man?
Good, man. Yeah, the month of March is always pretty exciting in the NFL, and all of a sudden you look at the calendar like, oh man, less than a month till the draft. So certainly going to get some answers to a lot of the questions we've had for a while.
Yeah, time's ticking for sure. So Kevin, I'll just kind of start right here. Everyone's talked about, the Lamar Jackson. Everyone's kind of on one side of the fence or the other. Curious your thoughts. Just initially, when you heard some of that kind of come out, Chris Ballard had some real transparent, words to say about Lamar Jackson. We don't typically hear Chris Ballard go into depth when you're talking about another player for another team. He usually is pretty hush when it comes to that, but he was pretty open with the media, down there in the owners' meetings. Just your initial thoughts with Chris Ballard and how he handled that situation.
Yeah, it was probably about what I would expect out of Ballard. I think this time of year, if you're a GM, you're really cautious about what you say, and you want to make sure that you're maybe throwing a smoke screen or two out there. And I think at the same time, Ballard looks at the Jackson situation and realizes it's pretty complicated. I think there's a lot of players on his own team that are probably confused about Lamar Jackson and why there's not more interest. Chris has always had a really good pulse of making sure that players, feel that they are treated fairly. And so I think Ballard looked at it and wasn't going to sniff any sort of contract talk, unlike his owner, and wasn't going to go down that path, and was going to make sure that, Lamar Jackson got the praise he deserves, which he is a special talent, as Ballard alluded to. I don't overly read a whole lot into it other than that. They would be wise to look into it. I mean, I've always been an advocate of no one is untouchable. You look and you listen and you make calls and you listen to calls, and just purely for intel more than anything. So about the answer that I expected from Ballard, it was honestly more the Irsay that I thought threw a decent amount of water on, any sort of Lamar Jackson fire.
Yeah, let's get into that. Jim Irsay, basically had mentioned, he was vehemently, and he just denied we do not want guaranteed contracts, right? Like he just said, hey, we don't want 100% guarantee. He thinks it's bad for the game. So you mentioned him throwing water on that, as well as, what you might have to give up to get a guy like a Lamar Jackson, and what you might have to give up, I think, is the most important part, Kevin, to me. Like, who on this team has to go if you're able to free up that amount of money to have to bring in a Lamar Jackson? Because you got to have 45, 50 million, you would think, a year annually to be able to free that up and to bring a guy like a Lamar Jackson in. And to me, it just doesn't seem very likely. I'll never rule anything out when it comes down to it, but it doesn't seem very likely at this point.
I probably fall in the same boat as you, unless the demands of Lamar Jackson really change. I can't see the Colts entertaining it for, a lot of the reasons that you laid out there. We really haven't, today, and I would say maybe yesterday on our morning show, we spent a good time talking about Jackson. It's probably the most we've talked about him all throughout the process, because I've just never viewed it as that realistic, considering what his demands appear to be and how I know Jim Irsay operates. And look at the quote yesterday, and I do want to mention, shout out to Zach Kiefer and Stephen Holder and Joel Erickson, and I know the Colts.com crew of Kevin Connors and JJ Stankovitz are out there. I've been fortunate to go to owners meetings in the past. It is an awesome event from a content standpoint. So kudos to them for going and for giving us, this information that we can chat about. But when I saw the Irsay quote, it was so spot on to what I would expect from him. He mentions, the ownership history. He mentions the Maras and the Hallases and the Rooneys and, whoever else that he threw in there. And I think Jim Irsay holds in high regard, and people could disagree with this. People could be, I'm not saying that this is like the exact way you should operate, but he wants to be kind of a steward for the NFL. And he is a big, big advocate for that in the history of the league, and feels like this is not a precedent that should become the norm. And, he didn't mention the Haslam family with Cleveland, and the Deshaun Watson contract, I think for probably good reason there. So I think that was worth pointing out again, that he just doesn't believe in that. And then, as you alluded to earlier, Zach, just the asking price. I mean, that's steep. And I thought the young quarterback draft the QB build during that early QB contract, rookie contract time, I couldn't agree more with Irsay. And on that front, obviously there's some things that I disagree with him on, but on that front, I thought he was spot on, and I think that's the right path to take. And Lamar is a wonderful talent. He's an incredible talent. But I'm a believer of you got to create this decade-long window. It's difficult, but like that's the type of window you need to try and achieve. And I just don't think Lamar Jackson at 20. I mean, you could argue 25 and 26-year-old Lamar Jackson hasn't been the same as his MVP season. What's he going to look like at 30 or 31?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, just so much to kind of digest. Do you think the trade with Carolina changes the thought process with Chris Ballard at all? I mean, it has to some degree, but I mean, do you think that's maybe why he's a little more willing to at least entertain the idea, knowing that now there's just going to be a guy off the board that you can't get now? I mean, it's pretty safe to assume 1 and 2 is going to go quarterback. We could debate that for the next 4 weeks of who that's going to be, but nevertheless, there's going to be 2 off the board. So you're going to be the third or the fourth best option.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. I want to try and be clear with my words here. I'm not saying the Colts are going to get the third best quarterback or fourth best quarterback at 4. But they're going to get the third choice or the fourth choice at quarterback. Like, obviously, look at the 2018 draft. Clearly, Josh Allen is the best QB, taken out of those first 4. You had the 4 go in the top 10 with Baker and Darnold, and then Allen, and then Josh Rosen. Now, look at that difference between the third choice and the fourth of that draft. So I think it's really important to mention choice. Not the best quarterback, because we'll obviously see how that plays out. But in a way, Carolina, really paid to be the first one to choose.
Yeah.
If you believe what they're saying right now, they are not 1,000%, hay in the barn locked up. And based off how much they're paying to send the amount of people they are to these pro days, it doesn't look like that they're etched in stone just yet. And I guess that's the debate that you have. And I thought the Ballard comments were interesting earlier this week of, we were not there yet as a franchise to make that move. And the question that you have, and that where I have a little bit of concern is, do you kind of take a risk and pay to think to yourself, we might get there as a franchise? And if we don't, then maybe you repivot or, you try and trade back or something like that. But Carolina's kind of said, hey, we're going to be uber aggressive. We think we'll get there eventually. So let's make sure that we get above at least, obviously Houston, who, by all accounts is going to take a QB. Yeah, I think you and I have talked about it, Zach. I certainly believe they should trade up to 3. I just think you want to be in control of having that third choice and not run the risk of some team potentially trading up. I realize it's going to cost something, but to me, walking into that store and having what's left on the shelves for you versus being the one that can at least pick one of the 2 items, I think is really, really important. But I thought it was an interesting comment from Ballard. I get what he was saying. Yeah, I mean, Shane Steichen was hired late in the process, hired much later than Frank Reich. And I understand that the Colts hadn't probably done their full homework on it. But, boy, wouldn't it be a bummer, man, if all of a sudden, they have a, top 30 visit with insert your quarterback here, and it's April 8th, and they're blown away by that guy. And Shane Steichen's like, oh, my gosh, neck up. He's Hurts. He's Herbert. He's Rivers. He's exactly what I want. And you can't do that. Whereas Carolina, of course, is in a position, albeit they paid big time, and we can get into a debate of if the Colts could have paid that to obviously have their choice of whoever they want.
Yeah, I mean, they paid for peace of mind is what they really did. At the end of the day, they don't have to worry about who it is, and they have time to settle that out and then work that out, inside the organization. Would have been nice if we would have maybe had an opportunity to trade up, but we don't. So we're living in the current moment, and we will be picking at 4 unless we do trade up to 3. One great takeaway I had, I was listening to your podcast before I hopped on here. Irsay, he didn't give a ringing endorsement of Chris Ballard. And, in the past, I know he's been very pro Chris Ballard. He didn't say anything, super negative about Ballard, but I like the fact that you feel like he's holding him a little more accountable. And it's really the first time I can remember, Kevin. I don't know about you. You followed a lot more than I do. That he publicly, he didn't go as far to say, hey, Chris is on the hot seat, but publicly said, hey, our expectations haven't changed. And everyone internally knows, from the coach to the general manager, all the way up the line, this is what we expect. And this is what I expect as the owner of this football team.
Yeah. I thought it was easily the first time publicly he has, been had restraint, little resistance. Some could call it just living in reality of what the results have been. But I mean, there's been moments where Chris Ballard is, or Jim Irsay has acted like Chris Ballard is, one step away from Canton, Ohio, and that's a little bit of fairy tale to believe that. And so it felt like that those comments were that. Now, what does it mean? He signed through 2026, so obviously you have financial commitment. In an ideal world, you'd obviously like to see him and Shane Steichen as a pairing have some years to grow and build together. No owner, thinks like, oh yeah, I'm going to just fire the GM the next year. That doesn't make sense. It makes things really awkward for Shane Steichen, especially with how Chris ran, so much of that head coaching search. So I think the hard thing, and I know you are a Pacers guy as well, but the hard thing is just going to be like, how do you evaluate this season then? The Pacers right now won 33 games. They've got 6 to go. By all accounts, they're going to have one of their worst win-loss totals in a decade. Yet, I call the season, borderline a roaring success.
Yeah.
And it's just so how we look at this year will be fascinating because, Peyton's first year was 3-13, and he threw the most interceptions still today of any rookie in NFL history. And yet, I'm not going to pretend to remember what it was like at the end of '98, but you were able to look at that and say, okay, that's growth. You got a top 5 pick, you draft Edra and you hit on that, and boom, you're 13-3 in the next year. And look at what Joe Burrow did in year 2. I know injury played into it. Look what Trevor Lawrence did in year 2. That's obviously what you're hoping for here. So, Irsay pretty much mentioned that of like, you've got to see hope. You've got to see growth in the right direction. It's not the most tangible thing in the world, but you've got to see that and feel that. And I thought that was, again, kind of the first time from him publicly to kind of admit the reality of, when you look at win-loss over-unders for the 2023 season, and the Colts are going to be, near the bottom of the NFL.
Yeah, Kevin, I think about it. Ballard's going to be judged by this draft. I mean, better or worse, whether you think that's the right thing to do or not. But that being said, everything leading up to the draft, how have you felt about how he's handled free agency so far? To me, it feels a little bit like more of the same. I wouldn't say that he's not been active. He hasn't tried to do anything. It's been very similar. I would just say this. He's done it a little bit faster than he has done it in the past, right? We had those signings that kind of came out early on, and we didn't wait, 3, 4, 5 days before that first signing came off the board. Just your initial thoughts of how he's went about free agency and his approach to, handling free agency. For me, I guess my last part of this, and I'll let you take it away, is I'd like to see him sign an interior lineman. He mentioned he would sign an interior lineman, so you'd have to take that for face value, huh?
Yeah, I would like to see another offensive move or two. To be honest with you, I've been a little disappointed by that because I understand that you're not trying to necessarily push all your chips into the middle of the table here in 2023, but this is the most fragile time in that young quarterback's career. Yeah. And if you don't get that right, you might never get the opportunity to get it right again. I'm not saying year 1 is make or break, but those early years are really pivotal. And it's why you can point to veterans throughout Peyton's first year or Andrew Luck's first year on the offensive side of the ball that I thought were really key and really important. And as of now, 3-ish weeks into free agency, we just haven't seen any activity outside of Isaiah McKenzie. And of course, you could call that kind of just a net, not a positive or a negative. The fact that you lost Campbell, I think it's a little disservice to Campbell just expecting McKenzie to come in here and exactly, fit the playing time and fit the slot role. But I was good with the McKenzie signing. I've always liked him, been intrigued by him, but he's obviously had a really inconsistent nature here to his game, particularly the last 2 years. So again, I would say a little bit disappointing with it. Not like overly pitchforky, but
Yeah.
it's just a little bit of like, man, kind of same old when I feel like you have the opportunity from a cap space standpoint. It's not massive, but you have something to, make some moves offensively. And I get that there is oh, well, you don't have a quarterback. It's hard to sign anybody. I think Ty goes to the quarterback team in that market, but I mean, listen to Samson Ebukam talk about why he chose the Colts. Money, you
Yeah.
know, money. You're very honest. So if you're able to show that money, you're able to make a move. And again, Zach, this dates back to last season. It's always been a mystery to me with Ballard in particular because he has been such an advocate to roster building is 12 months out of the year. Don't get caught up in March. Don't get caught up maybe even in April. We can find guys at different parts of the offseason and into the season. He's made that very clear. And yet last year we watched, one of the worst offenses from an efficiency standpoint this league has seen, certainly this franchise has seen, but this league has even seen. And we didn't see anything of substance. Tight end, wide out, O-line, really April, May, your June, July. I mean, I guess Dennis Kelly, if you want to call him that, like just so minimal on that end. Is that all on coaching? It just that one didn't add up to me. So I think it's been pretty similar to Ballard. And I just would like to see a little bit more on that offensive side of the ball to make sure that you support that young quarterback.
Yeah, Kevin, kind of going to Shane Steichen, I've kind of labeled him as a man of a few words. When it comes right down to it, he's short and straight to the point. But the one takeaway that I've gotten from him all off season is neck up. You mentioned it earlier, like he needs that in a quarterback. Do you feel like if you're sitting there at 3 or 4, that guy's going to be there with that neck up? There's so many different, ideas with Anthony Richardson, just an incredible freak athlete. A lot of unknowns. Will Levis is kind of the opposite. Seems like teams haven't really fallen in love with Will Levis the way he's kind of carried himself through this draft process. And then again, that could just be smoke. It is lying season when it comes to the draft. I guess my hesitation would be, Kevin, does that guy exist in this draft? Because you got to take somebody, whether you're going to roll with Gardner Minshew, you're going to sign somebody, or you're going to draft somebody. I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts as far as that goes with someone who has that neck up, mentality as far as a quarterback in this draft?
Yeah, I think it's the hardest part of the process to evaluate. It's the most behind the scenes part of the process as well. I mean, I'm not trying to compare these people to Tiger Woods, but from an off the field standpoint, but I'm sure we've all had that friend or that famous person that we thought was squeaky clean, and then boom, you find out something totally different, and it shocks you and it stuns you. So that's kind of what these scouts' jobs are, is to see, what are these guys like? It's why the Colts sent Brian Decker and Ed Dodds to Seattle to vet Jacob Eason back, in that 2020 season, or I guess it would have been 2019 leading into the 2020 draft. So much of that, again, is just stuff you can't see at a combine on the field. You can't see watching them play on Saturdays in the fall. But to your point, it's the most consistent message Shane Steichen has whenever he's asked about quarterback. He gets they all come in different shapes and sizes. He's had different shapes and sizes.
Yeah.
He's had different styles. But yet he feels like those three, and Phillip Rivers and Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts, all were wired, between the ears the way that you would want. So that's why the top 30 visits, it's why the private workouts, that's why they mean more than anything in my mind at that position. And that's just the difficult nature. I wish I could have more conviction with my answer on like, oh yes, I know this guy has it. I mean, I'd be lying to you if I felt really good about any of them. I mean, you hear great things, I think, about all 4 of them, to be honest with you. I don't think you have like necessarily a Kyler Murray question about any of them, or, insert your other quarterback. Even Eason, certainly had that question coming out of Washington. A big reason why he fell as far as he did. As far as Levis is concerned, I've heard a lot of people rave about, how he is wired as a teammate, his willingness to work, those sorts of things. Now is it smokescreen central of people coming out and saying, well, he's too cocky. I thought his cannon comments at the combine, I thought people were so overblown with that. To me, it was no different sort of belief in myself and confidence that you heard from any of the other quarterbacks. Bryce Young's probably the most timid of the four. I don't know if timid's the right word, but maybe the most reserved of the four. And yet you watch him play and you're like, that dude does not lack confidence whatsoever. He's poised beyond belief. So again, it's so fascinating. It's the hardest part of it. It's probably the biggest separator. For the most part, from what I've heard, I think I'd be comfortable with all four of them in that element, again, without truly knowing just how they are, what makes them tick and how they are wired.
Yeah, real quick question from Twitter. Big John 454. Big John, thank you for hopping on here. He's question for you, Kevin. Rank these in order, most likely. Gardner Minshew is our starter next year. Lamar Jackson is our starter next year, or we draft a quarterback. Most likely, in order.
Well, I would say the most likely is you 1,000% are going to draft a quarterback, John. I mean, I'd be beyond stunned if they did. And I think their first pick will be a quarterback, just to kind of obviously slot it into wherever that round one selection becomes. I'd put Minshew 2, and then I'd put Jackson 3 on that list. I don't think they know what Minshew's role is going to be. A lot of that's going to depend on, again, who you draft and how you handle that. On the Jackson front, I mean, those demands would have to turn in a hurry. I would say they would have to turn in a hurry. And then again, you probably would have to get deeper into this draft process and be like, woof, this is really bad. And I don't think, even Ballard's comments, I mean, he's mentioned, he likes some of the draft depth, whether you believe him or not on that. But I would have felt that way before the owners' meetings, but I don't know how you walk away from what Jim Irsay said earlier this week and think they'll do anything other than take a quarterback in round one. And again, Irsay can't help himself. He's always, honest about that. And I agree with him. I think it's spot on of like, you create the window where the first half of that decade is a chance to build. And again, the first half of that decade, we've seen numerous quarterbacks in recent years go to the Super Bowl on a rookie deal. So it's not like you can't do it in those first 4 or 5 years. But, the hope is you probably, get to 1 during that time, get to 2 on the back end of it, and you win 2 of those 3. And I know those are crazy, lofty goals, but I mean, Zach, I said it today on my podcast. I think as a Colts fan, don't you want to hear that? I mean, yeah, you haven't won a division since 2014, and there are a lot of steps you've got to get to that you haven't got to, but shoot for the moon and try and get there. And now the objective, of course, is the biggest part in trying to get close to that is obviously make this quarterback selection, Shane Steichen's development, continue to build around him and see what you got deep into the 2020s and potentially into the 2030s.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Guys, before we hop off here, light us up in the comments. If you haven't joined the No Horsing Around family, we encourage you to do that. We just hit over 500,000 likes, so I guess that deserves an LFG on this podcast right there. We're pretty proud of what we've done. Stephen and I are super thankful, and we try to say this every single time. Every interaction that we've had with you just means so much. So just keep lighting us up, and until next time, go Colts.